She did not warn him. She did not hesitate. That was how Howard Briggs would describe it later to the police officer, to the reporter, to anyone who asked, and many people did ask, because the sound that came next was the kind of sound that lives inside you permanently. Once you have heard it, a clean, terrible crack that split the pressurized silence of Flight 209's first-class cabin like a gunshot through glass, followed immediately by a cry from a 12-year-old girl that had nothing rehearsed in it, nothing polite, nothing held back, just the raw and unfiltered sound of a child in pain, and then the stillness of a cabin full of adults who had heard the same thing and could not yet make their bodies respond to it. But that was later. That was 30,000 feet in the air over a Tuesday morning that had started the way most Tuesdays do, quietly, without ceremony, without any indication at all that it was going to be the kind of day people remembered. The alarm on James Whitfield's phone was set for 4:45 a.m., but he was already awake when it went off, sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark with his socks on and his hands on his knees. Which was how he had woken up on travel days for approximately 2 decades now, because 20 years of pre-dawn departures had rewired something fundamental in him, had trained his body to surface from sleep before the sound, rather than because of it. And so he silenced the alarm without looking at it and stood up and began the particular sequence of small and ordered movements that constituted his morning. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet at 4:45 in the morning, which is a different kind of quiet from midnight or 3 a.m. It is a quiet that already contains the faint suggestion of the day beginning somewhere else, the distant sound of a garbage truck on the next block, the neighbor's porch light clicking on the world, starting its machinery slowly and without fanfare. James moved through the kitchen and put the water on and stood at the counter while it heated, looking at the room in the half-light, the room that was recognizably his and recognizably something else at the same time. His side of the house was ordered the way the cockpits he had flown for 20 years were ordered, a place for everything. Nothing unnecessary. No friction between intention and execution. The kitchen counter was clear except for 2 mugs he had set out the night before, both of the dark blue ones with the chipped handles that he had kept, for no reason he could rationally defend, except that they had been there as long as the really important things had been there. And he was not the kind of man who discarded things that had simply been present through enough of his life. Zara's corner of the house was something else entirely. Her backpack was against the wall by the front door, already packed zipped tight, which was a concession to the early departure time that she had made with the focused efficiency of someone who thinks 3 steps ahead before going to sleep. But the kitchen table, her domain after school, after dinner, after every other demand on the hours of a 12-year-old, was occupied by the project which took up most of its surface and had been taking up most of its surface for 7 months, and which James had learned to navigate around with the careful respect one extends to a thing that matters enormously to someone you love. The project was a model of a solar-powered air filtration system designed for communities without reliable electricity, built from recycled materials, deceptively simple in a way that had taken Zara 7 months to achieve, because true simplicity is almost always the most difficult destination to reach. And she had known that even at 12, and had refused to stop until she got there. Diagrams were pinned to a corkboard above the table. 3 different drafts of the written report were arranged in order on the corner of the table, the current one on top annotated in a handwriting that was smaller and more precise than most adults James knew. He touched his jacket pocket before he put the jacket on an old habit automatic as breathing, and his fingers found what they always found there. The small black USB drive, no bigger than his thumbnail, that had lived in that pocket for 16 months now. He did not take it out. He simply registered its presence the way you register a heartbeat, something that should be there, still there, and moved on. He was reaching for the second mug when Zara appeared in the doorway of her room, already dressed. Hair done, looking at him with the direct and slightly evaluating expression that was simply how her face was arranged in the morning before she had decided it was a situation that called for something else. "I was already awake," she said preemptively, as if he had been about to suggest otherwise. "I know," he said, and handed her the mug. She accepted it without looking at it, which was how she accepted things she trusted completely, and carried it over to the table and stood in front of the project with her free hand on her hip, examining it with the particular focused attention of someone who has looked at something many hundreds of times, and is looking at it now to make sure it is still what they remember it being, that nothing has shifted or settled or changed overnight in ways that cannot be undone. The project was going to a regional science competition in Boston. She had been preparing for it for 7 months, which was actually longer than the project itself had taken, because Zara's preparation included not just the building and the testing, but the anticipation of every question the judges might ask, and the construction of answers so complete and so clearly organized that there would be no ground left for uncertainty to stand on. She was thorough in this way with everything which James recognized as her mother's quality as much as his own. One of those things that had assembled itself in Zara from both of them and become something uniquely hers in the assembling. "The judges are going to expect someone different," she said, not looking at him. Still looking at the project, her voice carrying the particular flatness of a person stating a fact they have already processed and are not looking for commentary on just acknowledgement. James was quiet for a moment. Outside, the neighbor's car started up and pulled out of the driveway, headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen wall. "They're expecting something they've decided on before they walk through the door," he said. "What they're going to get is the thing you actually built." She was quiet for a moment. That meant she was considering that, and not dismissing it, which was different from the quiet that meant she had moved on. "Same thing," she said finally. "Not even close," he said. She looked at him over the mug, and something in her expression shifted just slightly, not into a smile exactly, but into the thing that lived immediately adjacent to a smile in Zara's face. The thing that meant she had heard him, and it had landed, and she was going to carry it with her without making anything more of it than that. James checked the booking for the 3rd time the way he checked everything 3 times, not from anxiety, but from the discipline of 20 years of pre-flight verification, the deep-running habit of a man who had learned that the 3rd check was almost never unnecessary. Seats 1A and 1B. Royal Horizon, Flight 209 departing 7:20 a.m., confirmation code unchanged from last night, from the night before that, from the 3 weeks ago when he had booked them both. He carefully packed the project into its padded case, the one Zara had selected with the same methodical consideration she applied to everything, and carried it to the door, while Zara finished her cacao and rinsed her mug and picked up her backpack and checked that the report was tucked into the exterior pocket where she had put it. Which it was, because she had put it there and then checked it twice before sleeping. They left the house at 5:30. The sky was the deep blue-black of early morning, the kind of dark that is already thinking about becoming something else, and the air was cold in the clean way that fall mornings are cold before anyone has driven through them yet. James locked the door. Zara stood on the porch step and looked at the project case in her hands, not anxiously, just with the particular focused recognition of someone who understands that they are carrying something that matters, and then she looked up and said, "Okay," in the voice she used when she had completed an internal calculation and arrived at a satisfactory result. "Okay?" James agreed, and they walked to the car. The airport at 6 a.m. had its own particular atmosphere. The layered smell of industrial cleaning solution and coffee from a dozen different vendors, and the specific recycled warmth of a building that never fully cooled the sound of rolling suitcases on tile, and the automated voices overhead announcing departures in the particular cadence of airports everywhere, unhurried and certain, and carrying within them the faint suggestion of elsewhere, of somewhere you are not yet but will be. Zara walked beside James with her backpack over one shoulder and the project case tucked against her chest, with both arms holding it the way she had held it since they left the house, firmly and without any indication that she was about to put it down or hand it to anyone for any reason. At the security line, she had placed it on the conveyor belt with her own hands and watched it go through the X-ray with the focused attention of a scientist monitoring an experiment, and had picked it up on the other side before the officer had finished gesturing toward the collection point. "You can let someone else carry it," James said, not for the first time. "I'm aware of that," she said in a way that made clear the information was not new and had not changed anything. He did not push it. He had learned over 12 years which battles with Zara were about genuine stakes and which were about her needing to control the thing she had made, and this one was clearly the latter. And the latter category was one he had learned to step back from with a respect that was not capitulation, but simply recognition of where things actually lived. At the gate, the agent scanning boarding passes was a young woman with a cheerful efficiency that seemed genuine rather than performed. And when she looked at Zara's pass and then at Zara, she smiled in a way that reached her eyes fully and said, "Window seat 1. That's the best one on this aircraft, with the easy warmth of someone who genuinely means it." And Zara said thank you with a directness that made the agent laugh a little, not at Zara, but with the small involuntary delight of an adult encountering a child who has not yet learned to be anything other than what they are. The jet bridge was narrow and slightly cold the way jet bridges always are, and James walked behind Zara and watched her carry the project case and thought about Boston and the competition and the 7 months of work inside that case and the expression on Zara's face when she had first shown him the completed prototype. Not proud exactly, more like satisfied, the expression of someone who has been pursuing a specific thing for a long time and has finally arrived at it and found it to be the actual thing rather than a reasonable approximation. At the aircraft door, the cabin crew was staged for boarding, and James registered them the way he always registered crew when he was traveling as a passenger, with the particular and somewhat automatic attention of a man who had worked alongside people in that role for 2 decades and had developed an instinct for the small signals that told him what kind of flight this was going to be. The purser was a woman in her mid-40s, platinum blonde hair pulled back with the precision of someone who understood that her presentation was a professional instrument. Her uniform immaculate in a way that communicated not just care, but a kind of controlled authority. And she was smiling at the couple ahead of James and Zara, with the specific warmth of practiced welcome, the smile of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and had developed a version of it that looked genuine from a sufficient distance. And then Zara stepped into the frame, moving around the couple ahead, and the smile changed. It was small, the change. Very small, quick as a passing shadow there, and gone in under a second, before the professional mask reassembled itself. But James caught it, the way he caught most things that were not meant to be caught. The slight hardening behind the eyes, the microscopic recalibration of welcome into something else, something that was not welcome at all, but had borrowed its outer shape. 20 years of flying had given James that instinct, the ability to feel the difference between a normal moment and a moment that was pretending to be normal, and this moment was the second kind. And he registered it and filed it in the particular internal place where he put things he needed to keep an eye on, and said nothing, and followed Zara into the plane. They found their seats without incident. Zara tucked the project case under 1A with the careful deliberateness of someone installing something valuable, checked that it was stable, and then sat down and buckled her seatbelt and pressed her forehead against the window glass to look at the ground crews moving on the tarmac below their orange vests, catching the pale early light. Their movements purposeful and patterned in a way that Zara was already, James could tell, trying to understand as a system. He settled into 1B and opened the newspaper he had been carrying in his bag for 3 days without managing to read, and the cabin filled slowly around them with the sounds of boarding. The bang of overhead bins, the murmur of conversation, the particular ambient noise of 100 people preparing to go somewhere, and for a few minutes everything was simply ordinary, simply the morning, simply 2 people sitting together in the way they had sat together many times, and there was nothing in that ordinary moment that announced what it was about to become. Her name was Diane Colton, and she had been with Royal Horizon for 13 years, which was long enough to have developed a relationship with every inch of a first-class cabin that was less like expertise and more like ownership. The deep, proprietary familiarity of someone who has spent more hours in a particular kind of space than they have spent in their own living room and has come over time to feel about it the way some people feel about their homes, that there are things that belong here and things that do not, and that the distinction is something they are qualified to make. She was good at her job. This is important to understand because what happened on Flight 209 was not the result of someone who was careless or incompetent. It was the result of someone who was skilled and experienced and carried within that skill and experience a set of conclusions about the world that she had never been required to examine, because nobody had ever made it necessary for her to examine them. In 13 years, 2 complaints had been filed against Diane Colton by passengers. Both had been reviewed and dismissed. And in the absence of any consequence, the absence of any friction, the absence of any moment that required her to stop and look at herself from the outside, the conclusions she carried had simply continued to harden, the way things that are never tested tend to harden until they were less like opinions and more like architecture. She had a word for the thing that drove her, though she would never have called it what it actually was. She called it professionalism. She called it standards. She called it the responsibility of maintaining the particular atmosphere that first-class passengers were paying for and had a right to expect, because that was the language available to her for the thing she was doing, the language that allowed it to remain invisible to herself, even as it was entirely visible to the people it was directed at. What she saw when Zara Whitfield walked into the first-class cabin at 7:08 in the morning was a child who did not belong there. And she reached this conclusion in the time it takes to blink before Zara had said a word or done a thing, arrived at it through some internal sorting mechanism that she had been operating for so long that she could no longer distinguish it from instinct, from the professional judgment she had cultivated over a decade of watching thousands of passengers board thousands of flights, and developing, as she understood it, an eye for people. The thing she could not see, the thing that her mechanism did not have a category for, was that the child she was looking at had been sitting in first class on her own intelligence for her entire life. In the informal sense that really matters, had been the person in the room who had figured out the thing everyone was struggling with before anyone else had finished reading the question, had been building things at 12 that many adults would not have known where to begin. Had been the kind of person who arrived at places early and stayed late and understood everything in the room and made it look like something she was simply good at, rather than something she had worked for, which was the hardest trick of all. Zara was sitting with her chin up and her shoulders back and her forehead against the window glass, watching the ground crews with open curiosity, perfectly at ease, in seat 1. In a way that was simply the ease of someone who has a valid boarding pass and has sat down and has no reason in the world to feel anything other than settled. And Diane looked at that ease and read it as something that required her attention. This was the mechanism. Not cruelty exactly, though the effect would be cruel. Not calculation, though it would look like calculation from the outside. It was something more reflexive and more embedded than either of those things, a way of organizing the world that had been constructed piece by piece over years and had never been asked to defend itself and so had grown to feel like reality rather than interpretation, like observation rather than judgment. She had served the couple in 2C first, bringing pre-flight water with the professional warmth she deployed reliably for passengers who fit inside the shape of her expectations. She had exchanged a brief and genuinely warm exchange with the man in 2B, Howard Briggs. She recognized him from a flight 3 months ago. She remembered names. It was part of the job, and had noted his phone on the armrest, and his pleasant, unhurried manner with the easy recognition of a regular who belonged. Then she had turned toward 1A. There is a version of this moment where she simply checks. The boarding pass confirms the seat assignment offers. Water moves on, and nothing happens. And the day proceeds as days are supposed to proceed when everyone does their job and goes home and none of what came after comes after. She did not take that path. She took the other one, the narrower one. the one that had been carved into the floor of her professional life by 13 years of unchallenged assumptions, and she walked down it toward the girl at the window seat with a smile that she genuinely believed was customer service, and that was in every way that mattered something else entirely. What she did not see, what her mechanism actively prevented her from registering as relevant, was the man in 1B who had lowered his newspaper before she had taken 3 steps, whose dark eyes had tracked her movement from the moment it began, whose 20 years of pre-flight instinct had already identified this as the kind of disruption that happens before anyone calls it a disruption, who sat with the stillness of a person who has not yet decided to act, but has already decided that he is watching. And she did not see, because no one had ever asked her to see it, the notation that had been placed in the Royal Horizon system against James Whitfield's Royal Horizon ID number, Captain Command Authority, 20 years service, current certification, 5 Safety Excellence Awards. The kind of record that, had she looked at it, would have told her everything she needed to know about the man sitting 18 inches from the child she was approaching. She had not looked at it. She had not thought to look. And that was the last ordinary moment before everything changed. Sweetheart, Diane said, and the word arrived wrong from the very first syllable, too sweet, too practiced, carrying inside it the shape of a conclusion that had been reached before the conversation had even started. I think there might be a little mix-up with your seat. Can I take a look at your boarding pass? Zara turned from the window. She was 12, not 6, and she had been 12 for a sufficient number of months to have accumulated a comprehensive working knowledge of what it sounded like when an adult was talking to her. The way this adult was talking to her, the particular register of patient condescension, the gentle framing that turned a demand into a request, and a request into something you were supposed to feel grateful for. The tone that suggested the person using it believed they were being gracious when they were actually being very clear about the arrangement of power in the room. She had heard it before. In the pediatrician's waiting room, when she had used a word the receptionist hadn't expected a 9-year-old to use, and the receptionist had smiled at James with the particular smile adults use to acknowledge a child's precocity without actually engaging with it. In the library, when she had asked about a section of engineering texts, and the librarian had offered her the children's reference books instead, gently, as if this were a service. In places she could not always name, but could always recognize because the feeling of it landed in the same place every time, a quiet, specific pressure in her chest that she had learned to take note of and keep moving through. I already gave it to the gate agent, she said, keeping her voice even, because she had also learned somewhere along the way that evenness was the right tool for this kind of situation, that evenness preserved your position in a way that other things did not. She scanned it. It's seat 1A. Diane's smile held its shape. Of course. But sometimes these things get a little confused at the gate, and we have a passenger who's supposed to be in 1A, so I just want to make sure we get everything straightened out before we push back. My dad is right here, Zara said, and gestured to 1B without looking away from Diane. James had set the newspaper down before Zara finished the sentence. He was watching Diane with the particular quality of attention he brought to situations that had not yet become problems but were moving in that direction, the same attention he brought to an instrument reading that was technically within parameters but trending in a direction he did not like, steady, undemonstrative, completely present. Is there a problem? He said. His voice was quiet, measured, the voice of a man who has no need to raise it in order to fill the space he is in. Diane recalibrated smoothly, shifting her attention to James with the professional adjustment of someone who has managed 1,000 variations of this conversation and knows that adult passengers require different handling than children. Sir, I just need to verify your daughter's seat assignment. We have some confusion at the front of the cabin, and I want to make sure everything is correct before departure. Her boarding pass is valid, James said. I confirmed it last night, and the gate agent scanned it 20 minutes ago. There is no confusion. Something moved behind Diane's eyes, small and quick, gone almost before it registered the look of a person who had expected the compliant kind of pushback, the uncertain kind, the kind that came from passengers who were not entirely sure of their own standing, and had encountered instead something they did not have a prepared response for, the kind that came from a person who was absolutely certain, and had no interest in performing uncertainty for the sake of making someone else comfortable. "Sir, I understand your concern," she said, and the sentence had the cadence of something that had been said many times before, polished smooth by repetition, "but I need to follow procedure and verify the seating assignment directly with your daughter. If you'll just allow Maya to come with me for one moment." "Her name is Zara James," said, and the correction was small, but it landed in the cabin with a weight that was larger than the words. In 2B, Howard Briggs put down his phone for the first time since boarding, the way a person puts something down when something else in the environment has just become more interesting. He had the broad, settled build of someone who had spent a lot of years in boardrooms and airports and had developed over that time an instinct for the genuine article for things that were about what they appeared to be about and things that were not. And what was happening 3 feet in front of him had the texture of the second category. The couple across the aisle had stopped their conversation. The overhead bins had all been closed and the ambient sounds of boarding had quieted. And in that particular silence, the specific exchange between Diane and the man in 1B became the thing the cabin was paying attention to, though nobody would have admitted to it, because the polite fiction of air travel is that the passengers around you are not witnesses to anything. "She is not moving from her seat," James said with the flat precision of someone stating a fact they have already decided is not subject to discussion. "If there is a genuine system error, you can verify it from the front without asking a child to get up." Diane changed approaches with the smooth, practiced fluidity of someone who had a repertoire and had learned to move through it when one method encountered resistance, because 13 years had taught her that resistance was usually temporary. That most people who began by holding their position eventually found reasons to accommodate. And the technique was to keep presenting new framings until you found the one that the other person did not have a prepared response to. She turned her attention from James to Zara, directly shifting her weight, angling her body slightly away from 1B, addressing 1A with the particular focused warmth of an adult who has decided to bypass the parent and speak to the child, which was a move that she had used before with some success, because children were often more compliant than their parents when addressed by authority figures. And compliance was what the situation required. "Honey," she said. And the word had the same texture as sweetheart, an artificial sweetness applied to something that was not sweet. "If you could just step out into the aisle for one moment just so I can see your pass up close, it would really help me sort this out much faster." "She can show it to you from here," James said, his voice unchanged in register but carrying within it a quality of finality that was not anger, not yet, not visibly, but was something that communicated clearly that the space for negotiation was closing and the person standing in the aisle had a shrinking window in which to make a different decision. Zara reached into her jacket pocket and produced the boarding pass and held it out, her arm extended toward Diane, steady and unhesitating, the laminated pass with its crisp Royal Horizon logo and the clear black type that said unambiguously 1A Whitfield Z, confirmation code and flight number and date, all precisely as they should be. Diane looked at it. She looked at Zara. She looked at James. And she did not take the pass. In 2B, Howard Briggs had his phone in his hand again, but it was oriented differently now. The screen facing the aisle, and his thumb rested against the side of it, in the way a person's thumb rests against a thing they are ready to use but have not yet decided to use. And he was watching the scene in front of him with the focused attention of someone who has understood that they are no longer a bystander to something routine. The woman in 3A had said something in a low voice to the man beside her that made him turn and look, and then continue watching, because the something was the kind of something that made you want to verify it yourself. Diane straightened slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice had shed some of its manufactured warmth, moving toward something that wore professionalism as its outermost layer. but had something harder underneath. Something that was not going to be satisfied by the boarding pass or by the gate agent's scan or by 20 years of air travel logic, because it had not been generated by any of those things in the first place. "I need the passenger to step out into the aisle," she said, and the phrase "the passenger" had a quality to it, a distance and objectification that James registered as the moment the exchange moved into different territory, the moment it stopped being about seat assignments and became about something else that Diane was not going to name and did not need to name because it had been present from the beginning, from the first second she had walked toward 1A with that recalibrated smile. He was already forming his response when Diane made her decision when looking at Zara holding out the boarding pass at the quiet, steady way Zara was doing it, at the absence of the anxiety and the apologetic scrambling that Diane's mechanism expected and had always eventually received. She reached the conclusion that this was a situation that required escalation. And she reached it with the swift wrongness of a person who has never had their conclusions tested, and therefore does not know what it feels like when a conclusion is wrong. What James saw from 18 inches away was Diane's hand moving before his brain had finished processing the intention behind the movement, a reaching toward Zara's extended arm, and in the fraction of a second between the reaching and the contact, he understood what was about to happen and felt the specific horror of a person who sees something irreversible coming and cannot close the distance in time to stop it. Diane's hand closed around Zara's wrist above the boarding pass and pulled. It was not a gentle pull. It was the pull of someone who had made a decision and was executing it, who had mistaken authority for the right to touch, who had somewhere in the architecture of her 13 years convinced herself that jurisdiction over a cabin included jurisdiction over the people inside it, including a 12-year-old girl who was holding out a boarding pass and asking to be seen, and had not been seen. Zara cried out, not from choice, not from strategy, but from the body's honest and uncontrollable response to pain and shock, and she tried to pull back, and the angle was wrong, and her body twisted against the force of the grip, and James was on his feet before the cry had finished, leaving her mouth moving the 18 inches that had been an ocean. And then came the sound. It was not a loud sound. That was the thing about it that stayed with everyone in that cabin long after they had tried to put it somewhere they did not have to carry it every day. It was not a loud sound. The engines were louder, the bins slamming had been louder, the boarding announcements had been louder. But it had a quality that cut through all of those larger sounds, like a blade through water, clean and complete the sound of something that was not meant to break breaking. And it hit every person in that first-class cabin somewhere below the level of thought, in the place where the body registers things before the mind has time to interpret them, and the effect of it was silence. A cabin full of people going completely still in the same instant like a single held breath. Zara's cry was the thing that broke the silence, and it broke it entirely. James had Diane's wrist in his hand. He did not remember crossing the 18 inches. He had no memory of the movement itself, only of being in his seat, and then being there, his grip precise and complete around Diane's wrist, not violent, but absolute. The grip of a man who had spent 20 years making physical decisions in confined spaces where violence was a luxury no one could afford. But precision was everything. "Let go," he said. 2 words level and certain, carrying within them no heat and no uncertainty and no invitation to negotiate. Diane released her hold. Her palm opened and her arm dropped to her side, and she stood in the aisle with the look of someone who had just arrived somewhere they had not intended to be and was still processing how they had gotten there. Zara pulled her arm back and pressed it against her chest, her face white and wet, her breathing coming in the short, uneven pulls of a body that has absorbed something it had no preparation for. She had her back against the window and her knees drawn slightly in occupying the least space possible, and she was not crying in the way children cry when they want something. She was crying in the way people cry when the body has made the decision for them and the mind is still trying to catch up. James crouched beside her, his big hands framing her face with a gentleness that was so entirely different from everything he had been in the last 60 seconds that it landed on the watching cabin like a change in weather. "Zara, look at me. I'm right here." She looked at him. Her chin was wobbling, and her eyes were full of something that was not just pain, but the particular kind of hurt that comes from recognizing that someone has looked at you and decided you were less than you are, and the recognition does not get easier with age, it just gets more familiar, and familiar is its own kind of damage. "Daddy," she said. That single word from a 12-year-old who had been working so hard to hold herself together, who had been steady through the request and the demand and the boarding pass and the pulling and the pain, did something to the cabin that none of the preceding sounds had done. It went through the walls that people in public put up between themselves and other people's private moments, went through them cleanly, and landed in the places those walls are designed to protect. Howard Briggs was on his feet. "What just happened?" he said loud enough that the question was clearly addressed to the plane itself and not to any individual in it. "Did she just break that little girl's arm?" The door from the forward galley opened and Dana Reeves came through it at something close to a run younger than Diane. Brown hair, practical shoes, the face of someone who has heard something that required immediate movement, and she took in the scene with the trained assessment of someone who has done first aid certifications and emergency drills, and is now encountering a situation that uses that training in earnest. And her face went through something very specific, a kind of controlled stillness that happens when the brain needs a moment longer than usual to incorporate what the eyes are reporting. "Oh my God," she said. It was barely a whisper. She was looking at Zara's arm. Diane in the aisle straightened her jacket. The Howard Briggs, who had been watching her continuously since the moment her hand had reached out, stared at this movement, the mundane, habitual act of straightening a jacket in the middle of a catastrophic moment, with the expression of a man watching something that has confirmed his worst assessment of the situation. His thumb, which had been resting against the side of his phone, completed its movement, and the recording began. She was resisting removal from her seat, Diane said, and her voice had found its professional register again, clipped and measured the voice of someone delivering a report, rather than someone who had just broken a child's arm. And I was acting within my authority as purser to address a seating discrepancy. The passenger became combative. The word combative sat in the air of the cabin for a moment. Nobody responded to it directly. The response was in the faces, in the expression of the woman in 3A, in the set of Howard's jaw, in the way the couple across the aisle looked at each other, and then looked back at Zara, pressing her face toward the window, trying to find some private space inside a very public plane. James rose from beside Zara and looked at Diane. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice once. "She is 12 years old," he said. "She was sitting in her assigned seat with a valid boarding pass. You broke my daughter's arm. I was enforcing protocol." "You broke my daughter's arm," James said again. The same words, the same register. And somehow the repetition drove them deeper than volume could have. The way a nail driven twice finds a more permanent hold. Dana had already moved to the emergency kit. Her hands were not entirely steady, but they were working, pulling out the splinting materials with the focused efficiency of someone letting their training carry the moment, because the moment itself was too large to carry consciously. "Sir," she said to James, "I'm going to help your daughter. Can you?" "I'm not moving," James said quietly. He shifted instead to Zara's other side, took her right hand, the good one in both of his, and watched Dana work with the full attention of a man who was simultaneously being a father and being something else, something already engaged with the question of what needed to happen next, what needed to be documented, what needed to be reported, and who was going to be held accountable for every second of what had just occurred in this pressurized tube at 30,000 feet. Zara was pressing her lips together and breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to impose order on an experience that is trying very hard to be disorderly. And she kept saying in a voice that was just slightly too controlled to be convincing, "I'm okay. I'm okay," in the way people say things they know are not quite true, but need to keep saying because the alternative is to stop saying anything at all. The businessman from 2B had not sat down. "Every second of this is going everywhere," he said, and it was not a threat, not a performance, just a statement of fact delivered with the quiet certainty that carries more weight than shouting ever does. And then Dana looked up. She was applying the second piece of the splint, her eyes level with the level of the seat, and she looked up at James in the particular way that a person looks up when they are about to say something, and something about the face above them stops them before they begin, because the face is familiar. In a way, they are still processing familiar from somewhere specific, from a briefing room photo, or a safety award ceremony, or the framed photographs in the Royal Horizon Operations Corridor in Terminal C, 20 years of service, and 5 consecutive safety commendations, and the kind of record that people in her industry knew the way musicians know certain names. She looked at him. She looked at the badge clipped to the inside of his jacket, the one he had carried out of habit, the Royal Horizon Captain's credentials badge, current and valid. Her expression did not change dramatically. It simply became very still. She turned toward Diane slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was very low, and Howard Briggs, leaning forward from 2B, caught every word. Diane Dana said, "That's Captain Whitfield." The silence that followed was a different kind from all the silences that had come before it. It had a different texture entirely, not the shock silence of the crack, or the grief silence of the name Daddy, or the outrage silence of the jacket being straightened, but the silence of a moment of reckoning, arriving the silence of a person hearing something that reorganizes every calculation they have made in the last 20 minutes. Diane's face changed. It was not remorse. It was calculation, the rapid internal arithmetic of someone assessing the distance between where they are and the worst possible place they could be. James looked at her for one long moment, then he turned to Dana. "Return to gate," he said. "I'll be in the cockpit in 2 minutes." He moved through the cabin slowly, which was not how he felt. He felt the way he always felt in the moments when everything had already been decided, and the only remaining question was execution. Clear, very cold, stripped of everything that wasn't operational. He walked through the first-class aisle at the pace of someone who has nothing to prove to the people watching him, which was everyone on the plane, because everyone on the plane was watching him now, and he looked straight ahead, because the goal was at the end of the aisle, and there was nothing between here and there that required his attention. Inside, in the place where he had spent 20 years learning to be quiet and precise, the thing he was actually feeling moved through him. Like weather, the retroactive terror of the 18 inches and the fraction of a second, and the sound that he was going to hear for the rest of his life whenever things got too quiet. And underneath the terror, the thing that was colder and more determined than any terror could be the knowledge of what he was going to do, and the absolute certainty that he was going to do all of it. His hand touched his jacket pocket as he walked. The USB drive. Still there, same as this morning in the kitchen, same as every morning for 16 months. But the feeling of it under his fingers was different now. Not a checkpoint, not a habit, but a question with an answer. Finally, after 16 months of waiting for the moment that would tell him what the answer was supposed to be. He thought about his wife. 4 years ago, an ordinary Tuesday, a car accident on a road she had driven 100 times, the kind of thing that happens to other people until it happens to you. And then the category of other people does not exist anymore. He had promised her something at the funeral in the wordless way that people make promises at funerals, not out loud, not in a ceremony, just a private and absolute commitment made to someone who was no longer in the room, but was still very much present. I will stand between her and whatever comes. Whatever comes. He knocked twice on the cockpit door and identified himself. A pause. The door opened. The co-pilot, young, careful, checking the credentials. James had already held up before the door fully opened, reading the name on the badge and then doing what people in aviation do when they read that name, recognizing it. Captain Whitfield, the co-pilot said. The surprise was present but controlled, contained inside the professional demeanor of someone who understood that this was not a moment for surprise. James explained in the flat and comprehensive brevity of 2 decades of emergency radio communication. Royal Horizon captain deadheading minor in his custody, sustaining a serious injury on board command authority, per Royal Horizon Operating Protocol Section 12. Return to gate immediately, medical personnel and station manager required at jetway on arrival. The co-pilot did not argue. In 20 years of Royal Horizon operation, James Whitfield's name had appeared in safety briefings, in commendation announcements, in the quiet professional conversations where pilots talked about the people who had set the standard. There was a reason people in his profession knew the name, and the reason was standing in the cockpit doorway with a look that communicated absolute and non-negotiable clarity. James sat in the observer's seat and picked up the radio and made the calls. And his voice in the radio was the voice that had been making calls in emergencies for 20 years, steady, precise, stripped of everything that was not the information being transmitted. The voice that the job had built out of him over 2 decades of situations where the only thing standing between a normal outcome and a catastrophic one was a person who did not add their own distress to the problem. From the cockpit window, he could see the gate rotating slowly into view. Gate 14. The jet bridge extending from the terminal, and he could see, even from this distance, the shapes of people beginning to gather there. The yellow vests of the ground crew, the darker figures of airport staff, someone with a radio already talking into it, because he had made the calls and the calls had been received, and the machine was responding. He thought about Zara in seat 1A with her arm against her chest and the green cast she was going to choose. He didn't know yet that it would be green, but somehow he already knew she would choose a color, would assert even that small sovereignty over the situation, and he made the last call to the Royal Horizon station manager at Gate 14, and the words he used were the words of a captain who has been in command for 20 years and knows precisely how much weight those words carry medical personnel standing by. Station manager on the ground. Airport security at the jetway door. Do not delay any of those requests. I am declaring this flight grounded pending investigation. Behind him in the first-class cabin, Diane Colton had refused once to go to the jump seat because the refusal was the last piece of control she had available to her, and she was not ready to release it. Dana Reeves had spoken to her quietly the second time, and this time she had said the name again. Captain Whitfield, and had said it clearly enough that the couple in 2A and 2C and Howard Briggs and the woman in 3A and everyone within range of a normal speaking voice could hear it, and the result of that second utterance of the name in the compressed and attentive space of the cabin was that Diane Colton went to the jump seat because there was nothing left to do but go. The plane turned. It moved backward from the heading it had been pursuing slowly and deliberately and with no ambiguity about its destination, and the passengers who had been watching the confrontation and the passengers who had been pretending not to watch it felt the change of direction in their bodies before the intercom confirmed it. And there was a moment of universal, wordless understanding that the flight they had been on was not the flight they were going to be on, that something had shifted that could not be unshifted. James put down the radio. He looked at Gate 14 through the window. Close now, the figures at the jetway distinct 4 people, as he had requested, none of them looking up yet, because they were still waiting. He thought about the USB drive in his pocket. 16 months. He had been carrying it and waiting because he had known after Carl Fitch's visit and the commendation and the raise and the cosmetically repaired component that had not actually been repaired, that speaking too early to the wrong person would result in a promotion and the truth going back into whatever drawer it had been in before. He had been waiting for the right person, for the right moment, for the specific combination of circumstances that would make it impossible for the thing he knew to be absorbed and managed and reclassified as something less than what it was. He had not imagined that the combination would come from this direction. He had not imagined it would involve his daughter. But it had come, and he was done waiting, and somewhere in the knowledge that he was done waiting, underneath all the terror and the cold fury and the grief of the day, there was a specific and weightless feeling that he recognized as resolve, the clear, navigable, entirely reliable feeling of a man who knows exactly what he is going to do. Gate 14 was there. He stood up. He went back through the cabin to his daughter, who was sitting in seat 1A with a splinted arm and a steady, unflinching face waiting for him. If this story has already made you feel something, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the bell. We publish stories like this every week, and every story matters. Drop your city in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, because every time we see where this story has traveled, it reminds us why we tell it. The door opened onto the cold white light of the jet bridge, and Dana came through, first stepping to the side to hold it, and then James, and beside James, tucked close under his right arm, with her splinted arm cradled against her chest, was Zara, who was doing the thing she had been doing since the crack, maintaining a composure that was 2 sizes too large for her, but that she was wearing anyway, wearing it the way you wear something uncomfortable, when the alternative is worse, because Zara had decided somewhere between the moment of pain and this moment that she was not going to give the day the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart completely. The paramedics moved in immediately. There were 2 of them, a man and a woman, both in their 30s. The woman slightly in front, the one who had clearly done this more and carried it more easily in her body, and the woman went straight to Zara, crouching to meet her at eye level, in the practiced way of people who have learned that children receive care more readily when you make yourself small. "Hi there," she said. "I'm Carrie. Can you tell me your name?" Zara looked up at James. He gave her a single small nod. She looked back at Carrie. "Zara," she said. Her voice was smaller than it had been on the plane, the adrenaline beginning its withdrawal, leaving behind it the larger and less organized feeling of pain that had been waiting for the adrenaline to finish. "Zara, that's a great name. Can I look at your arm?" James stepped back, not away sideways, remaining in Zara's sightline, and watched Carrie work with the attention of a man cataloging everything because he was already past this moment. In his mind was already 3 and 4 and 5 moves ahead, and everything he was observing was going into the record he was building with the methodical thoroughness that 20 years of aviation safety had made as natural to him as breathing. Gerald Nash reached him before he had taken 2 steps toward the gate. Station manager, 16 years, with Royal Horizon, a compact, careful man in a blue station vest who had the look of someone who had prepared for this walk across the jet bridge and had still not fully prepared for it because no preparation is adequate for meeting the person who has called you out of a meeting to tell you that one of your employees has broken a child's arm. He extended a hand. James looked at it for a moment, not rudely, simply with the honest assessment of a person who is deciding how much of the usual social rituals apply to this specific moment, and then he bypassed it and said clearly and without preamble, "My daughter has a broken arm. She was injured by your purser. I watched it happen from 18 inches away. There is video footage from at least 3 passengers that I am aware of." Gerald's hand came back to his side. "Captain Sterling. Captain Whitfield? I understand. I want to assure you that Royal Horizon takes this." There's something else James said, and the way he said it made Gerald stop talking. What happened on this plane today is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of something much larger. You and I are going to have a very specific and very detailed conversation. But right now, my daughter is the priority. Do you understand me?" Gerald understood him. He was a man who had spent 16 years reading rooms and reading people, and what he was reading right now was someone who was not making statements for effect, who was instead describing a situation with the flat accuracy of someone who had been studying it for longer than today. At the threshold of the aircraft door, Diane Colton appeared. Jacket straight bag over her shoulder posture assembled with the precision of someone who had decided that composure was indistinguishable from innocence and was going to maintain that theory as long as possible. A security officer stepped forward, steady, unhurried, and said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain on board for the time being." Diane stopped. She looked at the officer. She looked at James. She looked at Zara, who was sitting on the jet bridge floor now with Carrie working carefully on her arm and her eyes open and her face very still and composed in the specific way that children are still and composed when they are doing the hardest work of their lives, without anyone to tell them that is what it is. I acted within my authority, as Purser Diane said. There was a seating dispute. The passenger was non-compliant. The security officer looked at Zara. Then he looked at Diane. He didn't say anything for a moment. He let the distance between non-compliant and the 12-year-old sitting on the floor do its work, and then said quietly, "She's 12 years old, ma'am." Howard Briggs came off the plane with his phone in his hand, walked directly to Gerald Nash, and held the screen toward him. 4.5 minutes, he said. "Clear audio, clear picture." He paused. "You want to see it now, or should I just post it?" "Gerald?" Nash looked like a man watching something fall from a great height, helpless to intervene, only able to witness. Howard posted it. The hospital was bright and purposeful, and smelled the way hospitals always smell, a combination of antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular urgency that comes from a building entirely dedicated to the fact that bodies are fragile. And James sat in a chair in the imaging waiting area that was slightly too small for him, holding Zara's backpack in his lap, staring at a point on the wall that was not anything, just the place his eyes had gone while his mind was somewhere else entirely. His phone had been vibrating since the jet bridge. He had silenced it on the way to the hospital because what was on the other end of the vibrations was the world reacting to what Howard Briggs had posted, and the world reacting to things was a machine that moved fast and did not require his participation to continue moving, and he needed 11 minutes in this chair before he was ready to engage with it. A nurse appeared and told him Zara was doing well and was asking the imaging technician questions about how the X-ray machine worked, which the technician appeared to be finding both amusing and genuinely difficult to answer comprehensively. James said that did not surprise him. The nurse said she could tell. The doctor came out 15 minutes later, a tall woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the reassuring efficiency of someone who has delivered 1,000 versions of this conversation and has learned to be both precise and kind at the same time. "Clean fracture of the radius," she said. "No surgical intervention needed. Cast immobilization follow-up in 2 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks for full healing." Zara had been extremely cooperative. James said he was not surprised by that either. He went to the hallway and leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for 3 seconds, which was the ration he allowed himself, and in those 3 seconds, he let himself fully feel the retroactive horror of the sound in the cabin, the specific irretrievable quality of it, the way it lived in the body rather than the mind, and would not be stored somewhere accessible and manageable, but would simply be there in the way that certain sounds are simply there permanently, the way you don't choose where they go. He breathed through it, and then he opened his eyes and he walked back into the room. Zara was showing Carrie, who had ridden with them and was filling out paperwork in the corner, something on her phone, a video about the air filtration prototype's testing phase, explaining with animated precision how the airflow measurement had worked, and Carrie was leaning in with the genuine attention of someone who finds this actually interesting, and Zara was lit up the way she was only lit up when someone was paying real attention and not the performed version. James stood in the doorway for a moment and watched his daughter do the thing she always did, make the space she was in into a classroom for whatever she was thinking about, and let himself feel the complicated ache of that, the specific kind of love that contains grief and fear and relief and pride, all at the same time folded together in a way that doesn't separate cleanly. Zara chose dark green for the cast without deliberation, with the decisive brevity of someone who has allocated an appropriate amount of processing time to a decision and has arrived at the correct answer. She directed the casting technician on the smoothness of the edge at her elbow, with a focus that made the technician glance at James with a look that asked whether this was normal, and James confirmed with a small nod that it was. His phone rang. Robert Ames, VP Operations. James stepped into the hallway. The conversation was short and specific. Robert used the phrase "suspended pending investigation," and James said that was not adequate, and explained clearly and without heat why it was not adequate and what adequate meant, and what the word outcomes meant as opposed to the phrase pace of investigation. And he did it with the quiet certainty of a man who has been thinking very clearly for the last 2 hours and is no longer interested in the difference between what is easy to say and what is true. When he came back into the room, Zara was examining her green cast with the expression of someone who has assessed a finished product and found it satisfactory. "What color do you think?" she asked him. "I think you made the right call," he said. She held it up in the fluorescent light and turned it, and for a moment she was just a 12-year-old with a cast on her arm in a hospital room, ordinary and specific and entirely herself. And James stood in the doorway of that moment and did not want to move through it too quickly. Zara had spotted the pizza place from the cab window on the way out of the hospital, a hand-lettered sign in a fogged window that said, "Best slice in the state." No other advertising, no illuminated signage, just the sign, and behind it, the glow of a kitchen doing what it was there to do. That one, she said, with a conviction that foreclosed discussion. They sat at a small table near the back, the kind of table where the chairs are slightly mismatched and the tablecloth is plastic, and nobody expects anything except good food. And for 45 minutes, James put his phone face down for the first time all day, and they did not talk about any of it. They talked about the drying time of cast material, about whether the competition organizers would accommodate a contestant with one arm in a sling about the cannoli that the woman behind the counter described with such personal investment that declining felt genuinely rude, and so they ordered it and split it, and neither of them regretted it. Zara ate 2.5 slices. James ate 3.5. It was the best 45 minutes of his entire day, and he knew it while it was happening, which is the rarest way to know a thing. The hotel was near the airport. Zara fell asleep with her cast on the pillow beside her, slightly propped by a folded towel from the bathroom. Her breathing slow and even in the way it always was when she slept, as if whatever the world was doing had no access to her here in this particular piece. James sat in the chair by the window and turned his phone over. 400,000 shares in under 6 hours. The Royal Horizon, #trending across 14 states. 3 networks had run the footage in their evening broadcast, and every single segment had used the same clip, the moment of the reaching the sound, Zara's cry, and then James's face turning toward Diane with the expression that one anchor had described with no apparent awareness of how precisely this described it as the look of a man who had just decided something permanent. He read everything with the methodical thoroughness he brought to all information that was operational, reading it not because he enjoyed it, but because knowing where things stood was part of knowing what came next. A message notification. He opened it. A name he did not know, David Cho, National Tribune. Captain Whitfield. I've been investigating Royal Horizon for 29 months. I started because a source inside their maintenance division contacted me about inspection records that didn't match what was being submitted to federal regulators. That source went quiet 14 months ago. I believe today changed what's possible. If you're willing to talk, I think we can do something that matters not just for your daughter, but for a lot of people who don't know what's been happening. I'll understand completely if you don't respond. James read it twice, then a third time. His hand moved to the jacket hanging on the back of the chair, automatic the way it always moved, and his fingers found the USB drive in the pocket and rested there, and this time the feeling under his fingers was different from every other time in the 16 months he had been carrying it. Different from this morning in the kitchen, different from the jet bridge, different from the cockpit window. It felt like an answer to a question that had been waiting longer than today. He looked at Zara sleeping. The green cast on the pillow beside her, her breathing slow and certain. The project case on the floor at the foot of the bed still intact, still carrying 7 months of work that had survived the day, even when the day had not been survivable in other ways. He typed, "Give me until morning." He put the phone down. He looked at his daughter for a long time in the dark of the room, and he felt for the first time since the sound in the cabin something unlock in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but the clean, weightless, entirely reliable feeling of a man who knows exactly what he is going to do. David Cho was already there when James arrived, which told James something useful about the kind of person he was dealing with, because people who arrive first at difficult conversations are either very anxious or very prepared, and David Cho did not have the look of someone who was anxious. He was younger than James had expected. Mid-30s wire-rimmed glasses, the slightly rumpled quality of someone who slept better at his desk than in his bed, because the desk was where the work was and the work was where he was most at home. And he stood when James walked in and shook his hand with both of his, which James read as genuine rather than performed the difference being visible in the eyes. And David Cho's eyes were entirely present. "Thank you for coming," David said. "You said there were things the public doesn't know." James said, sitting down. "Tell me what you meant." David placed a manila folder on the table between them. He did not open it. He rested his hand on it and looked at James in the way that a person looks when they are about to set something down in front of someone else that they have been carrying alone for a very long time. 29 months, he said. "I started because a source inside Royal Horizon's maintenance division contacted me. He told me that certain aircraft in their fleet had failed. Routine structural inspections. Failed them definitively, not borderline cases, and that those failures had been logged in the internal system, but that the reports submitted to the FAA recorded passes. Different documents, different conclusions, same aircraft, same inspections." James was very still. Different, how he said. The internal records showed critical failures. The FAA submissions showed clean passes. David opened the folder and turned it around and slid it across the table. 15 aircraft over 4 years, specific tail numbers, specific inspection dates. In 3 cases, the failures involved stress fractures in primary structural components that under the wrong conditions sustained turbulence. Rapid pressure cycling could have resulted in catastrophic events. James looked at the documents. His training moved through him the way training does when it is deeply enough embedded, that it operates independently of conscious decision. The part of his brain that had spent 20 years reading technical data moved across the pages with a speed and retention that the rest of him was still catching up to, and what it found as it moved made the hand holding the folder tighten until the knuckles changed color. "Who signed the FAA submissions?" he said. "Mid-level maintenance supervisors. Men who were in my assessment not the architects of this, they were the people handed a pen and told to sign. The decision came from above. I believe it came from Carl Fitch, the VP of maintenance. And I believe Fitch was acting on authorization from Preston Vane himself, Preston Vane, the name that appeared in business magazines with the frequency of a cultural landmark. The founder and majority shareholder of Royal Horizon, the man who had built an airline from a regional carrier into the 5th largest in the country, through a combination of genuine operational vision and a particular talent for making the people around him feel that his success was a project they were participating in rather than a reality they were subject to. James had shaken his hand at 2 company events and walked away both times with the particular unease of someone who has just spent time with a person who is better at seeming genuine than being it, which was a quality James had encountered before in his career and had learned to identify with some precision. "You said you couldn't report this," James said. "I couldn't get it past my editors without a source who would go on record. My original maintenance source went quiet 14 months ago. A month after he went quiet, he received a promotion and a significant raise. I don't think that's a coincidence." David paused. "I need someone with standing, someone who has been inside this airline long enough and deep enough to speak about it credibly. Someone whose record the public already trusts. Someone who, as of yesterday morning, has the full attention of the national press and a legitimate reason to be asking every hard question that can be asked about Royal Horizons' operation." James set the folder down on the table. He looked at David Cho across the small table in the early morning quiet of the coffee shop, and he thought about the 20 years of his life that were embedded in the airline that those documents described, 20 years of trusting that the machines beneath him were what they were represented to be, that the systems behind them had integrity, that the people responsible for that integrity were being responsible. "You said 2 aircraft with these issues are still flying," he said. David looked at him steadily. "As of this morning?" "Yes." James was on his phone before the sentence was finished. Robert Ames picked up on the 3rd ring. "The tail numbers N3312RH and N5578RH, James said. "Where are those aircraft right now?" A pause. Typing. A change in Robert's breathing that was barely perceptible and was entirely perceptible to someone who had been listening for the subtle signals in other people's voices for 20 years. N3312RH is airborne. Robert said, his voice gone quiet. "Chicago to Atlanta. Departed 40 minutes ago." James closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them. "Grounded. Contact Chicago Center. Medical diversion if you need a reason. But get that plane on the ground right now." "James, I cannot authorize a diversion based on..." "Those aircraft have documented structural failures that were not reported to the FAA." James said, his voice dropping to its most precise register, the one he used when he needed the person on the other end to understand that this was not a conversation. "If that plane continues and something happens, every person in your legal department will spend the rest of their careers in a federal courtroom. Ground both aircraft. We will discuss the source of my information after the planes are on the ground." A longer pause. The longest yet. "And then I'll make the calls." James hung up. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the USB drive and placed it on the table between them, and David Cho looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been searching for long enough that finding it feels slightly unreal. 16 months, James said. "I was waiting to know who to give it to. My daughter's arm got broken yesterday by a woman who looked right at the proof that she was wrong and decided it didn't matter. And I decided I was done waiting. They had prepared for grief." That was the thing James noticed when he walked into the Royal Horizon conference room that afternoon, the specific preparations of a corporate entity bracing for a grieving, angry parent. The water glasses and the legal pads and the box of tissues on the credenza. The careful positioning of the HR director and the 2 attorneys, and Lawrence Greer. Preston Vane's deputy, who wore a suit expensive enough to be its own form of communication, and had the polished, maintained confidence of a man whose entire professional value was navigating exactly these kinds of rooms. They had not prepared for the folder James opened on the table without sitting down, and the tail numbers he led with, and the specific and documented discrepancies between Royal Horizon's internal maintenance records and the records submitted to the FAA over the preceding 4 years. "Before we begin," James said, "I want to be transparent. This conversation is being recorded." Lawrence's smile held its shape for a moment after his eyes changed. "Captain Whitfield, that's not for my own protection," James said. "You're welcome to do the same." He laid out what he had methodically completely in the order that would be most comprehensible to people who had not been living inside it for 16 months. The tail numbers, the inspection dates, the discrepancies. Carl Fitch's name, the sequence of authorizations that led through documentation he was prepared to produce to the highest level of the company's leadership. Then he laid out what he was requesting. Not asking, not proposing. Requesting in the flat and comprehensive language of someone who has decided that what follows is what follows and is not subject to amendment. Diane Colton terminated. Not suspended. 15 aircraft grounded until independent third-party inspection confirmed clean. FAA submissions corrected and refiled. Passengers who had flown on those aircraft notified. The individuals responsible for authorizing the falsification identified and referred to federal authorities. Lawrence Greer stared at him with the expression of someone doing very rapid and very unpleasant arithmetic. "You're asking us to expose the company to significant criminal liability." "The exposure already exists," James said. "It was created when your executives signed the forms. What I'm asking you to do is not create the exposure it's already created, but correct it before someone else corrects it for you. The difference between those two paths is significant for your company and for the families of the people who have been flying on those aircraft." The room was quiet, with the specific quality of quiet that descends when a group of people cannot argue with the logic of what they have heard and know it. One of the attorneys leaned toward Lawrence and murmured something that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Lawrence listened, and when he straightened, his expression had shed most of its professional polish and was something harder and more honest, underneath which James found more respectable in a way. The 2 attorneys and the HR director stood and filed out. Lawrence stayed. He and James were alone. The door opened again before Lawrence could speak. Sandra Obi, the HR director, had come back in alone without the attorneys carrying a leather portfolio that she had been holding since the beginning of the meeting without opening. She set it on the table in front of James and took a single sheet of paper from it, a printed email chain, and placed it before him. James read it in 40 seconds. He looked up. "I submitted a formal recommendation for Diane Colton's termination 8 months ago. Sandra said, based on 2 prior complaints that I assessed as credible. That recommendation was overruled by Carl Fitch." James was very still. "Do you have other copies of this?" "Yes." "Why are you giving this to me?" Sandra met his eyes. "Because I have a daughter. She's 9. James took the document. He added it to the folder with the care of someone handling something that had been waiting a long time to be in the right hands. He said, "Thank you," in a way that contained more than the words themselves. The call came on his way back to the hotel from a number he didn't recognize, and he picked it up because he was in the kind of day where unknown numbers carried a specific weight. "Captain Whitfield." The voice was unhurried in the way that voices are when they belong to people who have been listened to for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to compete for attention. "This is Preston Vane. I believe it's time we spoke directly." James said nothing. He kept walking, slowing his pace, and let the silence answer. "I want to begin by saying that what happened to your daughter yesterday is completely unacceptable," Vane said. "Diane Colton's termination was the right call, and I want you to know it came from my direction personally. I also want to be transparent with you. I understand you've been in conversation with Senator Okafor's office and with a journalist named David Cho, and I think before anything moves further, you and I should talk privately." Carl Fitch signed a falsified FAA inspection submission for N3312RH 11 weeks ago, James said. "That's not a previous operations team. That's your current VP of maintenance, 11 weeks ago." The silence on Vane's end was of a different quality from any silence in the conversation so far. the silence of a man revising very quickly the intelligence picture he had assembled before making this call. "I think we should discuss this in person before." "Agreed," James said. "My attorney will contact yours to arrange it." He ended the call. He stood in the hotel corridor for a moment. Then he opened the door to the room. Zara was on a video call with her best friend, holding her green cast up toward the camera with an expression that combined genuine pride with a considerable amount of theatrical flourish, while her friend on the screen alternated between expressions of horror and fascination in a rapid sequence that appeared to be fully involuntary. The conversation had the specific energy of two 12-year-olds processing a dramatic event through the medium of each other's reactions, which is perhaps the most effective processing method available at that age. James sat down in the chair by the window and looked at his phone and felt in the middle of everything the specific small grace of watching his daughter be exactly 12 years old. Senator Okafor's chief of staff, Tom Ellery, called while Zara was still on her video call, and James stepped into the hallway to take it. Tom's voice had the particular quality of a man moving fast through high-stakes logistics and finding clarity in the momentum rather than being overwhelmed by it. Senator Okafor wanted to meet today, 3 p.m. at the Federal Building downtown. She had a window, and she was insisting Tom's word, insisting that Zara be welcome to attend. She said Tom continued, and I'm quoting directly, "The daughter is the reason this matters." James needed a moment before he could respond normally. Something about those words, "The daughter is the reason this matters," sat in him in a way that required space before it could be absorbed. "Text me the address," he said. Back in the room, Zara had ended her video call and was lying on her stomach on the bed doing something on her tablet, her cast resting beside her, her feet in the air behind her in the easy unconscious posture of a child who feels safe. James sat on the edge of the bed and told her everything, the offer from Vane, the terms of what was being proposed, and the specific condition that she not testify. He told it to her straight without softening the edges, because Zara was not a person who benefited from soft edges, and he had known that about her since she was 7 years old, and he had learned to honor it, because honoring it was one of the forms of respect she needed most. She listened without interrupting. She turned over and looked at the ceiling, the cast resting on her stomach, rising and falling with her breathing. "They want to pay for it to go away," she said. "And part of going away is me not talking." "That's accurate." A long pause. She was doing the internal processing she always did with things that mattered, the real kind, not the performed kind. If they pay the $200 million, does that actually help people? The passengers on those planes. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because she had asked it seriously and told her honestly, some of it would help. But the full accountability, the public record, the criminal charges rather than just fines, the message to the broader industry, required the hearing, required the testimony, required the thing being done in the open, rather than managed into a settlement. "So it helps some people," she said. "But the people who made the decisions mostly get away." That's a fair way to put it. She sat up. Her eyes were steady and clear in the way they always were when she had already finished the calculation and was only now communicating the result. "I want to testify. I decided 3 days ago. I'm not changing it because they're scared." James looked at his daughter for a long moment and felt everything a father is supposed to feel in such a moment. The powerful, permanent instinct to put himself between her and anything difficult to absorb. Everything hard, so she wouldn't have to. And he felt all of it fully, and alongside it equally real, equally constant. The recognition that Zara Whitfield did not need protecting from her own clarity. "Okay," he said. He called Tom Ellery. "No deal. We'll see her at 3. Senator Patricia Okafor was 61 years old and white-haired and moved through rooms with the unhurried certainty of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that authority does not require volume, that the most powerful move in most conversations is simply to wait and to listen and to speak only when you know exactly what you want to say. She crossed the conference room at the Federal Building to Zara before she acknowledged James, which told him something precise about her priorities. And she crouched down to Zara's level, not condescendingly, genuinely, with the unceremonious directness of someone who considered eye contact a form of respect, and said, "I'm Pat. I've been following what happened to you since yesterday afternoon, and I want you to know that I think you're one of the braver people I've met in quite a long time, and I meet a great many people in this job." Zara looked at her with the careful evaluating attention she had recently learned to apply to adults in positions of authority, the specific kind of assessment that follows an experience like the one in Cabin 1A, and something in Okafor's face, the directness of it, the absence of anything performed past whatever internal examination was being conducted. "My dad is the brave one," Zara said. "I was just sitting in my seat." Okafor smiled fully genuinely, the smile of someone who finds something not just pleasant but correct. "That's the thing about courage," she said. "Sometimes it looks exactly like sitting in your seat." She stood and turned to James, and they shook hands with the brief and mutual recognition of two people who each know that the other is there for serious reasons and are prepared to match that seriousness. They sat James and Zara on one side of the table, Tom Ellery at the far end with his legal pad, and the focused stillness of someone who understood that their job in this room was to capture everything that mattered, without inserting themselves into the thing that mattered. And Okafor folded her hands and looked at James with the direct attention of someone who has no interest in preamble. "David Cho shared the document package with my office this morning," she said. "All of it. I've had 2 of my staff attorneys on it since 8 a.m. What they're telling me is consistent with what I've suspected for some time. What we are looking at is not a case of negligence or poor oversight. It is a deliberate embedded pattern of regulatory deception that goes to the highest level of this company's leadership." "Yes," James said. "I want to convene a subcommittee hearing within 10 days. I want you as primary witness. I want David Cho's documentation entered into the public record. And I want the FAA in that room explaining why their inspection process failed to detect discrepancies that a journalist was able to document in 29 months of independent research." She paused. "I want to be transparent about what that means for you. There will be pressure. My office has already received 2 calls this morning from individuals I recognize as representing Preston Vane's personal interests. They'll reach me directly as well," James said. "They already have." She noted she had read him correctly, "and when they do, I'll listen to whatever they say. And then I'll do exactly what I was already planning to do." Okafor looked at Zara. "May I ask you something?" Zara nodded. "When it was happening on the plane, what were you thinking about?" The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when a question of genuine weight has been asked, and the person who must answer it is actually going back to find the true answer, rather than the convenient one. Tom Ellery's pen was still. James looked at his daughter and made himself breathe at normal intervals. Zara was quiet for several seconds. Her eyes focused on something that was not in the room. And then she said, "I was thinking that I had the right boarding pass. I kept thinking that it's right here. It's in my hand. It says 1A, and she can see it, and she still doesn't care. That was the part that scared me more than the pain. Not that she hurt me. That she could look right at the proof that I was right and decide it didn't matter." The silence that followed that answer lasted long enough to contain everything it needed to contain the weight of a 12-year-old articulating the most precise description of a certain kind of wrong that 3 adults in that room had spent their careers trying to describe and had never managed to say with that economy, that clarity, that specific and devastating accuracy. Okafor looked at James. He looked at her. Neither spoke. "She should come to the hearing," Okafor said, finally. "If you're willing." James looked at Zara. You can make that decision yourself. Okafor turned to Zara. You wouldn't be under oath. A brief statement. Your father would be beside you the entire time. Zara's chin did the small wobble it did when something was reaching her that she was trying to carry without showing. She pressed her lips together for a moment and controlled it. Would it actually help? Like actually not just for show? Okafor did not hesitate. What you just said in this room about looking right at the proof and deciding it doesn't matter, that is the most precise description of what we're trying to address that I've heard in 6 years on this committee. Yes, it would actually help. Then yes, Zara said. James's phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. In the current context, that meant something specific. He excused himself to the hallway and picked up. Preston Vane's voice was measured and careful in a way that it had not been in their earlier conversation. The ease of it recalibrated into something more like precision. The voice of a man who had revised his assessment of the situation since the last time they spoke and had decided that directness served his interests better than management. He offered Vane's resignation a consent decree with the FAA $200 million for a passenger safety fund, and in exchange the hearing scope narrowed. Zara's testimony kept out of it. James stood in the corridor and looked at the closed door of the conference room where his daughter was inside and said, "No deal with the quiet finality of a man who has already had this conversation with the person whose opinion he respects most." The days between the meeting with Okafor and the hearing moved in the particular rhythm of time that is approaching something large quick on the surface where all the preparation was happening very slow underneath where the waiting lived. James worked with Tom Ellery and his attorney Clara Hines, who had the quality that the best people in high-stakes situations have of making complex things feel navigable without pretending they were simple, going through every document and every timeline and every discrepancy with the kind of preparation that left no surface untested, no question unanswered before it could be asked. He laid out everything: the maintenance concern he had filed 16 months ago, the cosmetic repair, the commendation from Carl Fitch that had arrived precisely timed to look like recognition and had actually been a transaction, the USB drive and everything on it. Zara worked with Clara too, not to change her statement because her statement was already exactly what it needed to be, and everyone who heard it recognized that immediately. But to understand the format of the room and what she would see and what she could expect, because Zara's way of managing difficult things was to understand them as completely as possible, and preparation was a form of respect she paid to things that mattered. And then Zara worked on the project. One-handed with a stubbornness that alarmed James for approximately 2 hours before he understood what it meant. This was not distress or avoidance. This was the thing that allowed her to remain fully herself in a week, when almost everything else was being decided by forces larger than her, and he stopped trying to redirect her toward rest and instead sat across the table from her, the way he always had, asking questions and handing her things when she needed them. Sunday night, late. James was going through documents at the table when his phone rang with a number he didn't know. A woman's voice, careful and rehearsed in the way that people are careful and rehearsed when they have been preparing a call for a long time and are finally making it. She said her name was Linda Marsh, that she had been a Royal Horizon flight attendant for 7 years, that she had left 6 months ago, and that she had watched the news and the hearing announcement and had spent the last 3 days deciding whether to call. She had been in the room during a conduct review as a witness, she said, when a passenger's complaint against Diane Colton had been formally assessed. The passenger, a woman named Carol Watkins, who lived in Atlanta, had filed the complaint with photographs of bruising on her teenage son's arm following a boarding incident almost identical in structure to what had happened to Zara. The complaint had been reviewed by Philip Reeves, a conduct officer who reported directly to Carl Fitch. Reeves had looked at the photographs and ruled that the conduct was within acceptable parameters of crew authority. Within acceptable parameters. With photographs of a child's bruised arm on the table. Carol Watkins still has the photographs, Linda said. She has them on a flash drive. She's been waiting 6 months for someone to call her. James wrote the name down. He thanked Linda with a warmth that was entirely genuine and that she clearly had not expected, and he hung up and called Clara Hines immediately and gave her the name and city, and Clara had Carol Watkins's number within 2 hours and Carol's photographs in her inbox. An hour after that, and by 10:47 on Sunday night, Tom Ellery's inbox contained an email from Clara Hines with the subject line, "Additional documented pattern evidence. Please see attached." Tom's reply at 11:03. "This changes Tuesday significantly. Thank you." The text from Robert Ames arrived at 6:47 Monday morning. Carl Fitch resigned an hour ago. Before he left, he handed legal a letter naming Preston Vane directly as the person who authorized the falsification program. "Legal is in chaos. I genuinely don't know if I should be calling you or running." James read it 3 times. Carl Fitch had not simply resigned, he had detonated. The man who had visited James's office with a commendation and a raise, and the specific unspoken message of, "We know what you know, and we would like you to keep knowing." It quietly had apparently calculated that the machinery James had set in motion was going to reach his door regardless, and that being on the right side of the resulting documentation was worth whatever it cost him to put Preston Vane's name in a formal letter. James texted Robert, "Don't run. Don't speak to anyone from Vane's team without your own attorney present. Keep the letter secure. Don't destroy anything." He set the phone down. He looked at Zara sleeping the green cast on the pillow beside her. Her breathing slow and completely even in the way it was always slow and completely even when she slept, as though the difficulty of the world were a thing she had agreed to encounter only during waking hours and had made a binding arrangement with her body about the sleeping ones. David Cho called at 6:58. "Fitch's letter is already out there." David said, his voice carrying the compressed energy of someone watching something happen that they have waited a very long time to see happen and still are not entirely sure what to do with their hands. "I don't know who leaked it, but 3 sources have confirmed it to me in the last 30 minutes. Vane's attorney has issued a statement calling it self-serving from a disgraced employee. But James, a letter like that combined with the maintenance documents, combined with the FAA discrepancies, combined with what the subcommittee is going to put on the record tomorrow, this is not manageable. Not for the airline as it currently exists. Not for Preston Vane." "Is the story ready?" James said. 29 months ready. Run it. All of it." He paused. "Make sure you mention the project. The air filtration system. She built it herself on our kitchen table." David was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, something in it that had not been there before, something that was on the other side of the professional distance he maintained as a matter of craft. "I'll make sure." James set the phone down on the armrest. He sat in the chair by the window for a long time looking at his daughter in the dim light of the room, and at 2 a.m. he stood up and did something he did not do often because it felt like a thing he could not afford on most days. Something that required more of him than he had to give on ordinary days. He talked to his wife. He stood in the middle of the quiet hotel room, his daughter's breathing the only sound, and he said out loud, barely above a whisper, the words he had been carrying toward her all day. "I'm doing right by her. I want you to know that. I'm doing right by her." The room was quiet. The air conditioning ran its steady, neutral hum. The city outside the window kept its late-night business without noticing him. James went back to the chair. The National Tribune notification came at 6:58 a.m. James clicked the link, and the headline filled his screen in the clean, authoritative font of a publication that had been doing this for a long time and knew how to say things that needed to be said. Royal Horizon's Hidden Danger. How America's 5th largest airline falsified safety records for 4 years, and why it took a 12-year-old girl to bring it to light. He read the entire piece before Zara woke up. David had written it the way the best journalism is written: clean, factual. Each claim supported each document, referenced each source, clearly attributed, the kind of writing that does not need volume because it has accuracy, and accuracy in a story like this does all the necessary work. He had written about the maintenance records and the tail numbers, and Carl Fitch and Preston Vane, and he had written about James's 16 months of documentation and the USB drive and the 2 aircraft grounded the morning before, and he had written about the passengers who had been on those aircraft and had not known what they were not being told. And at the end, in the last 3 paragraphs, he had written about a 12-year-old who had spent 7 months building an air filtration system at her kitchen table, who had been on her way to a science competition when a woman in a Royal Horizon uniform had decided that her boarding pass was not enough to establish her right to the seat she had paid for. He had written about the crack and the cry and the green cast, and the fact that not one part of what had happened had broken the steadiness or the clarity or the absolute conviction of a girl who had known from the moment she sat down exactly where she was supposed to be. James read those last 3 paragraphs twice. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and held himself together for the amount of time he needed to hold himself together. And then he straightened and he went back to being steady because Zara was about to wake up, and steady was what today required. She woke at 7:15, sitting up with the immediate and slightly blinking alertness that was her version of a gradual transition into consciousness, and her first words were, "It happened, didn't it?" James handed her the phone. She read the entire piece without looking up, without speaking, with the complete absorption that she brought to things she was reading seriously, and when she reached the end, she was quiet for a moment. That had a particular quality to it, the quality of someone taking the measure of something real. He mentioned the project, she said. He did. She looked at the green cast. She looked at the phone. She looked at her father. "People are going to know my name now," she said, and her voice was very controlled in the careful, intentional way it got when she was carrying something large and was choosing to carry it precisely. For a while, I want them to know about the project too," she said, "not just about the arm. I don't want to only be the girl with the broken arm." "You won't be," he said. "I promise." She looked at him with those eyes steady and dark, taking the measure of the promise, the way she took the measure of everything against the accumulated data of 12 years. And then she nodded once with the quiet finality of someone who has completed their assessment. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." Outside Royal Horizons, stock had dropped 14% by 9 a.m. 3 corporate partners issued statements of concern and distance before noon. The FAA released a formal announcement that it had opened an investigation into the maintenance record discrepancies and that 15 Royal Horizon aircraft would remain grounded pending independent inspection. Preston Vane's attorney issued a statement describing the events as a regrettable incident and characterizing the maintenance issue as one being actively addressed by existing leadership. And the response to that statement online was immediate, comprehensive, and merciless. Zara was on a video call with her science teacher, Ms. Adeze Nwosu, by 10 a.m., walking her through everything from the boarding pass to the Senate hearing in the methodical, organized sequence she applied to explaining things beginning to end, no detail omitted. Ms. Nwosu, on the other end of the screen, had her hand pressed against her mouth and tears running freely down her face, making no visible effort to stop them. "Zara," Ms. Nwosu said when Zara finished, "what you did, just sitting in that seat and not moving. That is the most courageous thing I have heard from one of my students in 20 years of teaching." "I just had the right boarding pass," Zara said for the 5th time in 3 days, with the same inflection each time, the inflection of someone who has determined that this is the accurate and complete description of what occurred and intends to continue saying it until the people around her accept it as the whole truth. "That is precisely the point," Ms. Nwosu said. James, in the corner of the room, heard this exchange and thought about the number of times in Zara's life she was going to be required to explain to well-meaning and genuinely caring people that doing the ordinary right thing should not require extraordinary courage, and about how tiring that would be, and about how she was going to do it every single time anyway because that was who she was and who she had decided to be. And the combination of those two thoughts, the tiredness and the certainty, made something in his chest ache in a way that had no clean name. Tom Ellery called at 2:30. The hearing was confirmed for Tuesday 4 days out. Full committee attendance. National press pool. Live broadcast. FAA administrator had been subpoenaed. Carl Fitch's attorney had been in contact, and there were strong indications he would testify voluntarily in exchange for cooperation considerations. And then, Tom said, Vane's attorneys reached out to our office within the last hour. He's willing to step down as CEO, accept a consent decree with the FAA, and commit $200 million to a passenger safety fund. In exchange, they want the hearing scope narrowed, and they want Zara kept out of it. The framing they're using is that they don't want to subject a minor to a public proceeding. James looked at Zara, who had finished her call with Ms. Nwosu and was lying on her stomach on the bed, reading her feet crossed in the air behind her, the green cast beside her, the easy, unconscious posture of a child who feels safe. "I'll call you back in 10 minutes, he said. He sat on the edge of the bed. Zara looked up from her tablet with the immediate, accurate attention of someone who has learned that when her father sits on the edge of the bed in that particular way, something worth paying attention to is about to be said. He told her everything. The offer, the terms, the specific request regarding her testimony, and the framing being used to justify it. He told it to her directly and completely without softening any part of it, because that was the kind of father he was and the kind of daughter she was, and the arrangement between them had always been that honesty was what they owed each other, even when honesty was heavy. She listened. She turned onto her back and looked at the ceiling, the green cast resting on her stomach, and she was quiet for long enough that the quiet itself was a form of thought. "If they pay the money, does it actually help people?" she said. "The passengers. The ones who didn't know about the planes." He told her honestly, some of it would. But a settlement without full public testimony limited the accountability. The people who had made these decisions might face fines rather than the criminal liability that a full record would establish. And the message to every other airline with similar practices would be significantly softer. "So it helps some people," she said slowly, "but it lets the people who did it mostly get away with it." "That's accurate." She sat up. She looked at him with the calm, certain expression of someone who has finished weighing and has arrived at her answer and is not interested in revising it. "I want to testify," she said. "I decided 3 days ago. I'm not changing it because they're scared of what I'm going to say." James Whitfield looked at his 12-year-old daughter for a long and specific moment, feeling everything he was supposed to feel as a father. The weight of the instinct to shield her, to be the thing that stands between her and whatever is difficult to absorb, the hard parts, so she doesn't have to, and he felt it, fully all of it, and alongside it, equally, real, the recognition that the hardest part of loving someone who knows their own mind is learning when protecting them from the world means getting out of their way. "Okay," he said. He called Tom Ellery. "No deal. We'll see the senator on Tuesday." James wore his captain's uniform. He had deliberated about it for 2 days, turning it over in the methodical way he turned over decisions that mattered, testing it from different angles, asking Clara Hines who said what the best people say. When the right answer is the one you already have, it's your choice, and whatever you feel most yourself in is the right call. He put on the uniform because it was not a performance. It was 20 years of fact. It was every flight he had ever landed safely, every crew he had ever protected, every passenger who had sat in a seat behind the cockpit door and trusted that the person in front of that door was exactly what they were supposed to be. He was not going to walk into that hearing room as anything other than what he was, because what he was had earned the right to walk into that room and say what it was going to say. Zara wore a white blouse and dark pants and her green cast, and she walked with the specific quality of bearing that she had carried since she was old enough to walk the bearing of someone who knows precisely where they are going and has no uncertainty about their right to be there. Tom Ellery met them at the entrance to the Senate building and shook James's hand and looked at Zara and said, "Ready?" And Zara said yes, without any pause or qualification, and Tom Ellery, who had been managing high-stakes situations for the better part of 2 decades, nodded once with the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they needed confirmed. The hearing room was larger than James had expected, though he had expected it to be large. The press pool was at capacity. Every seat in the public gallery was occupied. The 12 senators at the raised bench had the particular focused attention of people who knew they were being watched by a great many people and had each individually decided to be worth watching. Senator Okafor sat at the center of the bench, and when James and Zara walked in, she caught James's eye and gave him a single small nod, the nod of someone acknowledging the arrival of something that has been a long time coming. Carl Fitch was already at the witness table when they took their seats. He was a tall man who had become physically smaller since James had last seen him. Not in any literal sense, but in the way that people compress when they have been carrying something very heavy for a long time and have recently set it down and found that the putting down is not the relief they expected but a different, harder weight. He had his hands folded on the table and he was looking at them, and he did not look up when James and Zara sat down, and the looking down was the most honest thing about him. The room settled by degrees, conversations ending, notebooks opening, phones going to silent, and then Patricia Okafor tapped her microphone once and said, "This hearing of the Senate Aviation Safety Subcommittee will come to order," and the last ambient sounds of the gallery went quiet, and the only sound was the particular charged hush of a room full of people who know that what happens next is going to matter. Carl Fitch testified first. His attorney sat beside him and touched his arm twice during the testimony, at moments when the attorney clearly preferred a different choice, but had no power to compel one because Carl Fitch had decided that precision was the only thing left available to him that was worth anything, and he was going to be precise. He gave dates, he named documents, he described the meetings, and he named the person who had run them, who had sat at the head of the table and made the decision that the discrepancy between what the internal records showed and what the FAA received was an acceptable cost of doing business not once but twice, clearly into the live microphone in a federal hearing room on national television. Preston Vane. The gallery made a sound the second time the name was spoken, not quite a gasp. Something more collective and more involuntary than that the sound of a room full of people absorbing the specific weight of a man naming his employer in a formal proceeding on national television and understanding all at once that the thing everyone had suspected had just become the thing on record. One of the senators leaned forward. "Mr. Fitch, to be entirely clear for the record, you are stating that Preston Vane, founder and CEO of Royal Horizon Airlines, personally authorized the submission of falsified maintenance records to the Federal Aviation Administration." Carl Fitch looked at the senator. "Yes," he said, "on at least 6 separate occasions over 4 years. I have emails, calendar invitations, and internal memos documenting each one. My attorney has submitted copies to this committee." James, watching from his seat, felt none of the things he had expected to feel: no triumph, no release, none of the satisfaction he had imagined might come from this moment. What he felt was the steady, specific attention of a man watching the horizon he has been navigating toward for 16 months finally become solid ground, and who knows, there is still a step or two left before he can actually stand on it. James testified for 54 minutes. He walked the committee through the maintenance concern he had filed 16 months ago with the methodical completeness of someone who has been preparing this account for precisely that long. The specific component, the specific date, the specific and implausible speed of the documented resolution and the discovery, when he went to check the component himself, that the repair had been cosmetic, and the underlying problem had not been touched. He described Carl Fitch's visit to his office, the commendation, the raise, the careful and professional and entirely unambiguous message delivered through the medium of reward rather than threat, because threat leaves evidence, and reward is just business. He described the 16 months of documentation that followed the USB drive, the specific reasoning behind his silence, not fear, not complicity, but the calculated certainty that speaking too early to the wrong person would result in his promotion and the erasure of the truth. He described the morning he met David Cho and the documents that changed from investigative theory to operational emergency, and he described the 2 phone calls to Robert Ames that had grounded 2 aircraft that were, as of that morning, still carrying passengers who trusted that they were safe. 4 senators asked questions. He answered each one with the same qualities, precision, completeness, the directness that left no gap between what he said and what he meant. The voice of someone who has been telling the truth about difficult things for long enough to have made it entirely automatic. Zara sat beside him through all of it, her good hand folded in her lap, her green cast resting on the table, completely still in the way she was completely still when she was paying absolute attention to something which was not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of full engagement of a 12-year-old who understood what was being said and why it mattered and was present for every word of it. The last question came from Senator Okafor. "Captain Whitfield," she said, and the room shifted slightly at the change in her register. Something in her voice had become more careful, as if the question she was about to ask was one she had been holding a long time and wanted to deliver correctly in your 20 years of flying commercial aircraft, including 14 years with Royal Horizon. Had you, prior to the events of this week, ever filed a formal complaint with a federal regulatory agency about safety concerns you observed? "No," he said. "Why not?" James was quiet for a moment. That was not uncertainty but selection, finding the words that carried the precise weight of what was true without adding to that weight or subtracting from it. "Because I believed the internal systems would work," he said, and his voice was level and even, and carried within its evenness the particular weight of something that had been considered many times and arrived at through genuine reflection rather than convenience. "I believed that when I filed a maintenance concern, someone would act on it in good faith. When that didn't happen, I documented everything, and I waited for a moment when speaking would matter enough to be worth the risk. And then my daughter's arm was broken by a woman who looked at the proof that Zara was right and decided it didn't matter. And I realized I had been waiting 16 months while people were boarding aircraft that had failed structural checks and trusting that the people responsible for their safety were being trustworthy. There is no right moment," he said. "There is only the moment you decide that what you know is more important than what it cost you to say it." The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something has been said that cannot be improved upon by anything that could be added to it. A silence that was not empty but full, the specific fullness of words that have found exactly where they needed to land and have landed there. "Thank you, Captain Whitfield," Senator Okafor said. James sat back. He looked at Zara. She looked at him, her eyes steady and entirely themselves, and she gave him a nod that was 12 years of everything compressed into a single small movement. Then she stood up and walked to the witness table and sat down. She adjusted the microphone the way the technician had shown her efficient, no-wasted movement and placed her written statement on the table in front of her, and the people watching could tell within the first few seconds that she was not going to need it, because she had spent 4 days making it part of her. The way she made everything part of her, that she decided to carry thoroughly without shortcuts until it was hers. She looked at the room. 12 senators, a press pool, a gallery full of people she had never met, cameras that were feeding to somewhere larger, She was 12 years old with a green cast on her arm, and she looked at every one of those cameras with the same unwavering steadiness she had brought to everything else to the boarding pass. Held out in cabin 1A to the hospital, where she chose her cast color and explained her project to a paramedic to the Senate preparation sessions, where she asked the kind of questions that made experienced legal professionals pause and then answer carefully. On the morning of this week's events, she said, and her voice was clear and steady and exactly the right volume for the microphone, neither too small nor performing larger than it was, I boarded Royal Horizon Flight 209 with a valid boarding pass for Seat 1A. I sat in that seat. A flight attendant named Diane Colton told me I needed to move. I showed her my boarding pass. She could see it. It said, Seat 1A. She grabbed my arm and broke it. She paused. 1 second. The room was the most silent it had been all morning. I've thought a lot about what I want to say here, about what matters most out of everything that happened. And what I keep coming back to is something I said to Senator Okafor when we met. Diane Colton looked right at the proof that I was right and decided it didn't matter. That hurt more than my arm. Not the pain. The decision. The choice someone made to look directly at the truth and decide it was less important than what she had already made up her mind about me. She looked at the committee. At Okafor specifically for a moment before continuing. I found out this week that 2 other passengers filed complaints before me. One of them had photographs of bruising on her son's arm, and a man named Philip Reeves looked at those photographs and ruled it acceptable. Someone decided those complaints didn't matter either. Her chin did the small wobble it did when something was reaching her that she was working to carry upright. She controlled it, pressed her lips together for half a second, and went on. I don't know those people's names, but I've been thinking about them. I've been thinking about how they did the right thing and then nothing happened and they had to live with that. The room was completely still. I'm 12 years old, she said. I'm not here because I'm brave. I'm here because my father taught me that when you know something is true, you don't get to keep it to yourself just because it's easier. He didn't teach me that by telling me. He taught me by watching him live it every single day. She looked sideways at James' brief and specific and entirely personal, a 12-year-old's version of I love you, delivered in a room full of cameras and recorded for posterity, and then she looked back at the committee. I also want people to know that the reason any of this came to light is not only the broken arm, it's the 15 aircraft. It's the passengers who flew on those planes and didn't know the records had been falsified. I want the people who were on those flights to know that someone noticed, someone documented it, someone didn't put it in a drawer when it was inconvenient. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at the committee with the clear, direct, entirely open expression of someone who has said what they came to say and has nothing left to add. That's all I have, she said. The room did not respond immediately. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, during which the room simply held what Zara Whitfield had said in it without adding to it, without reducing it, without doing anything except allowing it to occupy the space it deserved to occupy, the space of something true and precise and said by the person who was most qualified to say it. Senator Okafor spoke first, and her voice was different from every iteration of it that had been heard in that room over the preceding hours, quieter, lower, the voice of a person speaking rather than a senator conducting. Thank you, Zara. Thank you, Zara said. She stood up. She walked back to the seat beside her father, and James placed his hand on the back of her chair as she sat down, not touching her shoulder, just there, resting against the wood a millimeter from presence, close and steady, and without the need to be anything more than that, because that was enough, and had always been enough, and she knew it. Preston Vane resigned as CEO of Royal Horizon 4 hours after the hearing ended, and the statement his attorneys issued used the phrase stepping back twice, and the word committed 3 times, and the phrase regrettable incident once more, and the public received it with the same response it had given to every carefully managed word that had emerged from Vane's direction since the morning of Flight 209. Not with forgiveness and not with anger exactly, but with the particular permanent skepticism that attaches itself to language that has been deployed too many times in the wrong service. 15 Royal Horizon aircraft were permanently retired following inspections that confirmed the structural issues documented in the falsified records. 9 of the 15 received the word critical in the inspector's report. 9 aircraft, flying daily, full passenger loads, for periods of 8 months to 2 years. The word critical was a technical designation, and it was also, in ordinary human terms, the most honest word that had been used in connection with those machines since the records were first falsified, and it landed in the public understanding of what Royal Horizon had done with the weight of something that cannot be made smaller by careful language. Carl Fitch received a cooperation agreement that reduced his federal charges and resulted in a suspended sentence. He gave a brief statement outside the courthouse on his sentencing day, and only one sentence of it was remembered afterward, the one that said, "I told myself it was a business decision." It was not a business decision. It was a choice, and I made it, and I have to live with what it could have caused. Philip Reeves was terminated and named in a civil suit brought by 3 former Royal Horizon passengers, including Carol Watkins, who described the settlement in her interview with David Cho as significant enough to matter. Sandra Obi was promoted to Chief People Officer and spent the following year building the kind of conduct review independence that had been absent for the previous 13. Diane Colton was convicted of aggravated battery in a courtroom she entered in the same pressed jacket with the same professional posture, and what people remembered from the sentencing hearing was not the sentence itself, but the moment when the judge looked at her directly and said, "You looked at a child's boarding pass, saw that it was correct, and proceeded anyway." That decision is what this case is about. She served 11 months before a conditional release. The words that decision echoed in a way that the sentence itself did not, because the sentence was a number, and the words were the truth of what had occurred, and the truth was what had needed to be said aloud in a formal room for a very long time. David Cho's article won the National Journalism Award for investigative reporting. In his acceptance remarks, he thanked 3 people, his original source inside Royal Horizon's maintenance division, whom he did not name: Captain James Whitfield and Zara Whitfield, who had built a solar-powered air filtration system that her science teacher described as one of the most original and practical student projects she had encountered in 20 years of teaching, and who had entered the regional science competition the following spring, and who had won. James was in the front row of that competition auditorium, the same seat he had occupied at every single thing Zara had done that required an audience every science fair, every awards ceremony, every presentation since the 1st grade. The specific seat that was close enough to see her face clearly, but far enough that she had room to be her own thing out there, not an extension of him. He watched her stand at her project table and take questions from the judges. 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women in lanyards, making their way down the row with the professional skepticism of people who had seen 100 student projects and had learned to wait for the ones that were actually exceptional rather than simply ambitious. They reached Zara. He watched them ask the first question. He watched her answer. And then he watched the thing he had been watching for 12 years. The thing that happened to people's faces when they encountered Zara Whitfield genuinely engaged with something she understood completely. When they realized that what they were looking at was not a promising student, but someone who had actually figured out the thing, had gotten all the way to the bottom of it, and come back up with the answer in her hands. The judges' faces changed. One of them asked a follow-up question, and then another, and then the 3rd judge was leaning forward with his notebook open, and Zara answered everything patiently, precisely, with the calm thoroughness of someone who has prepared for every possible question and is now simply in the place where the preparation lives. Her name was called. She walked to the front of the room and accepted the award with the same expression she had worn in the Senate hearing room, clear and steady, and entirely herself, the look of someone who has been in difficult places and is now in this place and knows the difference and is grateful for it without needing to say so. She looked out at the auditorium, found her father's face in the first row, and gave him the small and specific smile that was her version of everything. The smile that contained within it the green cast on the pillow and the "It's okay, Daddy" from the jetway, and the "You promise a lot of things," and the "Yeah, okay," and the one-word Daddy that had unraveled an entire cabin at 30,000 feet, all of it compressed into one small curve of her mouth that only he could read the full contents of. James smiled back. His hands were steady in his lap. His eyes were clear. The night before the competition, he had knocked on her bedroom door to tell her lights out, and she had been sitting at her desk looking at the green cast, not wearing it anymore. Her arm healed, but keeping it there on the desk beside the project she was getting ready to carry into the auditorium in the morning, the way people keep things that have become part of the record of who they are. He sat on the edge of her bed. She didn't turn around immediately, still looking at the cast, and then she said, "Do you think she knows Diane Colton? Do you think she actually understands why?" He thought about it the way she asked it honestly, without the comfort of a ready answer. "I don't know," he said. "But that's not yours to carry. What's yours is knowing that you were right. That you sat in your seat, and you held out your boarding pass, and you didn't move." She was quiet for a moment. She reached out and touched the cast lightly with one finger. "I kept it," she said. "I don't know exactly why. You don't have to know why," he said. She nodded. She stood up and turned around and looked at him with her clear, evaluating eyes, and for a moment she was just his daughter standing in her room the night before something important. The same way she had been the morning of Flight 209. The same morning, quiet, the same steadiness. "Okay," she said, and she got into bed, and he turned off the light. He stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment, not doing anything, just standing the way parents stand in hallways after bedtime, when the house is quiet and the magnitude of what they love is briefly visible all at once, when there is nothing between you and the full weight of it, and you simply have to let yourself feel it, and then keep going. The green cast was on the desk in the dark room. The project was beside it ready. His daughter was asleep. Everything that had needed to fall had fallen. Everything that needed to stand was standing. And a girl who had simply held out a boarding pass and refused to move had changed more than a flight. She had changed what the word proof meant in a room full of people, had changed what the word acceptable meant in a formal document, had changed what it meant to look at the truth directly and choose what to do with it. James walked back to his own room. He sat in the chair by the window the way he had sat in so many chairs by so many windows, and he looked out at the city doing its ordinary business, and he thought that ordinary was the best word he knew for what he hoped the coming days would bring. Ordinary Tuesdays, ordinary science projects, ordinary mornings with cacao and a newspaper and a daughter who was already awake before the alarm, carrying everything she carried with the specific, unshakable grace of someone who had been taught not by being told, but by being shown what it looked like to be a person in the world. He thought about his wife. He didn't say anything out loud this time. He didn't need to. She already knew. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something real, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, because every week we bring you stories about courage, justice, and the people who refuse to be moved. Drop your city in the comments right now. Tell us where you're watching from, because this story has traveled further than we could have imagined, and every location you share reminds us why we tell it.